So we are all dealing with the effects of the COVID-19 shutdown, and as we all prepare to try and decide what we should do, we all face the same question. How bad is this thing? So the first thing we need to ask is, bad compared to what? We need a benchmark. The simplest one is the flu. We all kind of know the flu, and while COVID-19 is different from the flu, it is a virus. So it has two essential data points that are going to be the same as the flu. What we want to know is, number one, what is the transmissibility rate? Or in common speak, how contagious is it? And the other thing we want to know is the actual mortality rate, or in common speak, how deadly is this thing? These really are the two main things the average person wants to know in order to judge how bad it is. With the flu, we already know these numbers with a pretty high degree of accuracy, and we plan our lives accordingly. So if we know these two data points for COVID-19, we can then compare it with the flu and react accordingly. Now, it's kind of beyond dispute that COVID-19 is much more contagious than the flu, as that data is very clear. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on what I think is the most important data point of all, and that is, how deadly is this virus? How big of a risk is it to human life? My hypothesis is that COVID-19 is much more contagious than the flu, but that its mortality rate is probably only around maybe double that of the flu. So it's kind of in the same ballpark. In my estimation, what we are witnessing is essentially an extra strong flu season that normally happens every year, but it's being condensed down into a 4 to 6 week period, and that is causing panic. Now, this is not to downplay this as, it's just another flu bug. This is still something that needs to be taken very seriously. But if my hypothesis is true, then COVID-19 may be far more manageable than a lot of people have thought. So let's look at the data. First, let's remember that case fatality rate and estimated actual infected fatality rate are different things. Case fatality rate is when you just look at the confirmed positive cases and then compare that with the deaths. So when you all go onto Worldometer and you see 2 million people that have confirmed cases and 134,000 dead, what you're looking at is the case fatality rate. It's the number of people who are tested as positive versus the deaths. And in the US, the case fatality rate is about 4%. So here's a question. What is that number for the flu? If we look at the CDC data, this flu season they've done about 300,000 flu tests that resulted in positive results. And they expect about 25 to 60,000 people to die. So while the estimated actual infected rate for the flu is about 0.1%, the flu has a case fatality rate of 8 to 20%. Which is significantly higher than the case fatality rate for COVID-19. Now, please note, this may not be a good comparison. More people are certainly going to get tested for COVID than normally test for the flu, and that's totally fair. But the reality is that the case fatality rate does not indicate that COVID-19 is more deadly than the flu. Yet people are often panicked when they look at the case fatality rate on sites like Worldometer and they see these numbers on the news. So the flu's actual death rate, aka the infected fatality rate, is based on how many people they estimate actually had the flu, and the actual fatality rate that they've come up with based on that estimate is about 0.1%. So that leads us to the question of how many people do we estimate actually have the coronavirus? The reality is we don't know. No one does. But we're starting to see some studies that are giving us some very strong suggestions as to how many actually have it. For example, one study was of 239 pregnant women in New York who were all tested regardless of if they had symptoms. And they found that 15% of those women tested positive, yet only about 3 of them said that they had any symptoms. Now just be aware, I'm going to link below all of the articles and things that source these different studies that I'm talking about. Also, there was another study in Germany that kind of came up with fairly similar results to that pregnancy study. In Germany, they tested 1,000 people randomly in a particular town. And they were checking to see how many of these people had built up the antibodies. And they were shocked when they found that 14% of that 1,000 people, or about 140 people, already had the virus pass through them. They'd already built up the antibodies. And only about 2% of the people had tested positive. So based on these two samples, somewhere around 7 times the number of people that currently have it already had it. Now maybe that's high. However, if those numbers were the same in the US, if those ratios held, and we assume, let's say, roughly 25% of people who actually have the virus have gone out and got tested for it and come up as positive, that would mean 18 million people in the US either have or already had it. That would mean that our death rate is closer to 0.15 or 0.2%, which puts us kind of in the same ballpark as the flu, though still more deadly. Another place where we can really get a good idea of how deadly the virus is by looking at the Diamond Princess cruise ship. This ship is like a floating case study because we can actually measure the entire population that was exposed. Now, some people freaked out because they saw that 2% of the people on that boat died. But what they didn't do was factor in the age of the passengers. We have to keep in mind that the ages of the passengers on that cruise were much older than the average population in the US. So when a group of Stanford researchers adjusted the mortality rate for age on the Diamond Princess cruise, they found that it was about 0.2%, or about double that of the flu. Additionally, The Economist recently ran a story the other day about a Duke's biometrics researcher and his team who were using CDC data to look for a surge in flu-like illnesses reported in early March, before all this kind of took off. And what did they find? They found that in early March, there was a surge of flu-like illnesses. And according to their numbers, they estimate that during early March, 7 million people got the coronavirus. And then in the next 2 to 3 weeks, when most people who contract the virus will die 2 to 3 weeks later, they looked at that and what they found was about 7,000 people died in the next 2 to 3 weeks in the US. So what this suggests, if their numbers are accurate, is that the mortality rate is about 0.1%, or about that of the flu. So what does this all mean? Honestly, I'm not sure. But for me, knowing the actual fatality rate on this is the single most important piece of data that we need in order to evaluate how bad this virus is and what measures are or are not reasonable to take in order to save lives. Is there solid data out there showing that this is far deadlier than the flu? If so, what is it? And how does that data estimate the actual number of people who have had the coronavirus already? I will admit that this is not perfect data, but it's the best I've been able to access so far. Luckily, antibody testing is coming out soon in mass, and that will shed a lot more light on this issue. With that said, if these data trends hold as additional testing is done, it would mean that this disease may be much more manageable and much less deadly than previously thought. And perhaps what we are seeing amounts to a super contagious bug cramming an entire bad flu season into 6 weeks, and that's what's causing us panic. But at this point, I guess we'll just have to wait for more data to come in. But I'm cautiously optimistic, and I hope our leaders make decisions based on facts, not fear. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.